With Hashem's help, we're going to learn today Yevamos Daf Yud Gimel. We left off Yevamos Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis, 4 lines, or maybe 6 lines from the bottom of the page, where the Gemara says Eini. So a quick recap. We learned in the Mishnah said that there will not be a case where the erva of the mother-in-law or any other erva related to Chamoisa can be someone who can do miyun, which would retroactively nullify the marriage, which would then change the law of the Mishnah that Sarah's erva is aser, because she would retroactively become a non-married wife. So it's a practical thing. A woman who's a mother-in-law cannot do miyun, being that miyun is only done by a ketana. So the Gemara challenged that. It's like a challenge in Mitzias, quoting the Tanid of Bibi, Kamed Rav Nachman, about the 3 women that are allowed to use a moich. And we quoted the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who used the words that a ketana, shema tesabar, v'shema tamus, implying that she might die if she's a minor giving birth, but she might not die. So why can't you have a case where there's a mother-in-law who got pregnant when she was 11, who gave birth 9 months later, whose daughter was married off through another Torah marriage of the father marrying off a daughter. So there's a possibility where a mother-in-law can do miyun. So the Gemara changed the version in the meanwhile, and the Gemara says that you have to read into Rav Meir that if a woman of 11, if a ketana, if a girl of 11 becomes pregnant, for sure she will die. Ema shema tesaber v'tamus. And again, just repeating the Amar Rabba Bar Livoi, that Rabbi Bar Livoi said, Gevul Yeshla, Koidem Zman Hazeh, that everything is with a limit. Before 11 years old, a girl, Eini Mesaberes Kolikir, will never get pregnant. Toich Zman Hazeh, from 11 till 12, he Mesa, V'ubra Meis, for sure, she will die and her fetus will die. After she's 12 years old, she can live and her baby can live. Bottom line is, we changed the Girsa in Rabbi Meir by saying not Shema Tesaber V'Tamus, but for sure Tesaber V'Tamus. That's where we were up to, says the Gemara Eini. Eini V'Hatani Rabbi Bar Shmuel. Rabbi Bar Shmuel learned the Braisa, which articulates the same din that we learned in our Mishnah. That we cannot give the case of a woman doing miyun if she is a mother-in-law or related to that family of Arayas, the mother of the mother-in-law, the mother of the father-in-law, that this can be neither with a woman who became an islandess, because an islandess means a woman who cannot give birth. If she's a mother-in-law, it means she had a baby. She is not an islandess, nor oim shemiyanu, nor it could be in a case where she made miyun. Why? So it says in his braisa, because if it would be speaking about a mother-in-law that could do miyun, shekfar yoladu, she already gave birth. Now, if the correction in Rabbi Meir is correct, if Rabbi Bar Livoi is correct, that a woman who's 11 years old cannot give birth, so for one to be a mother-in-law, she for sure must be 12 or older, then the girsa there should not be shekfar yoladu. It should have been shekfar gadlu. She's already an adult. The fact that it says that miyun is not shayach by a mother-in-law because she already gave birth implies that even a minor can give birth. Even a girl under 12 can give birth.
The implication there that once the girl gives birth, she can no longer do miyun?
Correct. So now the question is only why. Either because if she gave birth, she's an adult, which then the Braisa should have said shekfar gadlu. So the Gemara says, no, shema tesaber v'shema tamus. Rabba's wrong, Rabbi Bar Livoi. And the original girsa we had in Rabbi Meir is correct. And yes, a girl under 12 might be able to have a baby. Ella kashyahach. So the question is, why is it not shayach by a mother-in-law miyun when it's possible for someone under 12 to do miyun? L'chayra, because it's possible for someone under 12 to become a mother-in-law? Answers the Gemara, Amar Ab Safra, that banim hareihem kesimanim. What makes a girl leave the status of a ketana and enter into nara? We learned until now her turning 12 and her getting the simanim. Simanim is her having 2 pubic hairs, and we will from now on just use the word simanim. She has the signs of developing into maturity. Says Rab Safra, really that's the way we will learn it, that simanim is not the cause, it's not a siba for her to become an adult. It's only a siman. So just like the simanim becomes a siman of her becoming an adult, having banim, even though she's not 12 years old, is also a siman that she entered adulthood, that she's no longer a ketana halachically. So yes, she's under 12, but she has a din of an adult, and therefore she's not able to do miyun. Other people say that Rab Safra worded it by saying that not that having children is just like having the simanim, it's better than simanim. So the Gemara just asks, L'may nafkamina, if it's just like or better? So the Gemara explains, Dafilu Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, and by the way, we learned before that our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. So we would want our Mishnah to fit Latana of Rabbi Yehuda. That Rabbi Yehuda holds that a nara isn't only a girl that's 12 and has 2 hairs, but Rabbi Yehuda holds at sheyirba hashachar, that she has to have, she has to be later, more advanced in her development. It has to be completely covered with hair. So even according to Rabbi Yehuda, having a child is just like yarba hashachar. It's even better than the normal siman. All right. And therefore, that she no longer has a din of a ketana, and therefore we stand well by both acknowledging that a girl under 12 can have children, and at the same time, the Mishnah says that a mother-in-law can never do miyun, because if she had children, she has a din of a gedoyla. Turning to Daf Yud Gimel, the Gemara says another answer. We learned in Masechtas Nida that Rab Zvid doesn't hold that a girl leaves her status of ketana and only enters the stage of nara when she's both 12 and she has simanim. Rab Zvid holds that simanim in itself is enough to make a girl become a nara, for not to be a minor. Now, this is only after she's 11, but she has to be 11, and if then she has simanim, she's an adult. So Rab Zvid Amar, ein banim below simanim. According to Rab Zvid, the only thing that makes her into a gedola is simanim. So say better, that if she had children, Rab Zvid would say it's not like it is just as good as. That a girl will only have children if she actually already developed the simanim. So, same thing. She had a baby, she's not a ketana. So the Gemara says, if that is the way you understand Rab Zvid, and a girl to become an adult needs to have simanim, elamai, there's a presumption that if you have a baby, she had simanim. Why should we rely on a presumption when we can actually make an examination and know for sure? The nivdaik, why don't you examine her, this girl who gave birth, to see if she has the simanim? So the Gemara says that examination is not a foolproof system, because chayshin and shema nashru, because the hairs might have fallen out. So counters the Gemara, hanicha lamanda amar chayshin, el lamanda amar ein chayshin ma'ekel amemer. In Masechtas Nida, when the Gemara is discussing the opinion of Rab Zvid, who holds that a girl only becomes a nara with the simanim, and even if she's not 12 years old, Rab Zvid doesn't demand an examination, because normally we could rely on the presumption that if you are 12, for sure the girl developed simanim. The question there in Nida is what were to happen if for whatever reason someone saw this girl, this young girl, and saw that she does not have simanim, but she's already 12. So there's an argument, whether do we say that since she's 12, for sure she had simanim. You don't see it? It fell off. Or we don't say that the hairs fell off, and if you saw her without simanim, then she's not yet a nara. So according to that opinion, why don't you make an examination, because we're not choishish that it fell off? So the Gemara says, even according to the opinion that holds that by a normal young girl, 12 years old, that you actually saw her that she does not have simanim, ein chayshishin, and she doesn't yet have a din of a nara because she has no simanim, that is if she didn't have a child. But if a girl had a child, had a baby, then everyone agrees mishum tzar leida, because of the body change that happens during childbirth, then the hairs that were there fell off. Bedika is not going to be a proof. We don't have to do bedika. There's a presumption by a 12 years old that she has simanim, and there's a presumption by a girl who's not yet 12, but who had a child, that she had simonim. In any event, the Mishnah stands correct when it says that a mother-in-law can never do miyun. Miyun can only be done by a girl who has the halachic status of a ktana. Continues the Mishnah. The Mishnah added that according to the din, as we'll see soon, which is only the din of Beis Hillel, which is the halacha, that whenever one of the women that fall to Yibum is a erva, not only is she exempt from Yibum and Chalitza, but so is her co-wife. Then the Mishnah added, and so is the co-wife of the co-wife. Like the example we gave, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. So Reuven married Shimon's daughter and a co-wife. Reuven dies, Shimon cannot do Yibum with his daughter, he's exempt with the co-wife. Levi did Yibum with the co-wife. Levi could have done Yibum with Shimon's daughter, but he did it with the co-wife. And Levi was married to another wife, and now Levi dies, so Shimon cannot even marry the co-wife of the co-wife. So the Gemara says, Minohan Amili, that the co-wife of the co-wife is also exempt. She is considered an erva. So there are two answers. Rav Yehuda answers, it's based on the pasuk. The pasuk that we used before for Isha elachoyse lisikach litzroir, from where we learned that a tzaras erva is exempt. And the Torah could have written lotzoir. So from the extra reish, litzroir, hatoira ribza, tzarais harbe, it's a plural expression of a co-wife. That means the co-wife of a co-wife. And Avashi says that we don't need the pasuk litzroir. Perhaps the extra reish is not really extra. Tzaroir means the tzaras erva, the co-wife of the erva, but tzvarehi. Now that the Torah taught us that the co-wife of an erva is considered an erva, so think about it. So now she becomes an erva. If she becomes an erva to Shimon, even though she's married now to Levi, so Levi's co-wife, the other co-wife, is a co-wife of an erva. So just like the original co-wife of an erva becomes a erva to Shimon, so now she became an erva. So now that her co-wife is weiter a co-wife of an erva. That erva, that my tamasira, because the b'makim erva kayama, she becomes like an erva. Well, tzara nabi b'makim erva kayama. Weiter. Then the Mishnah says, Keitzad im mesu. So the Mishnah taught us a din that the whole din of a Mishnah, that tzaras erva is exempt in Yibum and Chalitza. That's the way we'll learn. If when Reuven died, he was then married both to the daughter of Shimon and to the co-wife and to his co-wife. So therefore, since one of his wives is a erva to Shimon, Bita, so was the co-wife. What were to happen, says the Mishnah, if before Reuven died, that's the way we learn it, Reuven divorced the daughter of Shimon. In other words, when he died, he only had one wife that's not related. So we don't say, since she was once the co-wife of an erva, she's asur. We don't say that. Now we look at the moment of death. Says the Gemara, in other words, afilu, it comes from our Mishnah, that kanes, ulabasoiv gireish, even if there was a time when Reuven was married together with an erva to Shimon and a co-wife, all we care is the time of death. Says the Gemara, there is a Mishnah later we will learn in Daf Lamed.
That goes against the logic of Rav Ashi.
No, it does not. It does not. It does not.
Once an erva, always an
No. Rav Ashi is saying like this: the din of Yibum only begins by death. So, being that Reuven divorced the daughter of Shimon before he died, that means that when the din of Yibum came into the world, he was only married to one woman, Miriam. So she's b'chlal not an erva. Nothing to do with this. It's irrelated. So the Gemara says, "V'rimino." It's mashma from the Mishnah later. That's not the case. I'll say this first by heart. It's mashma from the Mishnah later that when do we say that Shimon is allowed to marry the co-wife of Reuven? Only if Reuven was not married at the same time to Shimon's daughter and another woman. In other words, if Reuven was married first to Shimon's daughter and he divorced her and later he married up some Miriam, that is when we say that if now Reuven dies childless, Shimon has a mitzvah of Yibum with Miriam. We don't say that since Reuven was once married to an erva, he never is going to marry his co-wife. That is where we say this din. But if there was a moment in the marriage where Reuven was married to both an erva and a co-wife, that's what's mashma later, then she always becomes exempt from Yibum and Chalitza. What's the case of the Mishnah later? Gimel Achim, there were three brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. So two of them were married to two sisters. In other words, the case of the Mishnah later is not the case that we're using here of Bitoy. Here, the example is Achois Ishtoi. So there's Reuven and Shimon who married the two sisters of Rachel and Leah. And as we continuously give as an example, Reuven married Rachel and Shimon married Leah. And Echad, and the third brother, Nasui, Nachris, was married, not God forbid to a guy, but Nachris means to a non-related woman. So Levi here is married to Miriam. Then the Mishnah says, Girish Echad mebal achois ishtoi. Reuven divorces Rachel. And after Reuven divorces Rachel, the case there was Umeis Hanasui Nachris, Levi dies. When Levi dies, so Miriam falls to Yibum, to either Reuven or Shimon. And the case is that ideally the Bukhar does Yibum, Vikinsa, Hamagadish, Reuven married now Miriam. Reuven was not married to Achais Ishtoi and Miriam at the same time. She was already divorced. Then he married Miriam. And now Reuven dies, Umeis, and now he dies. Zui Shamarno, this is the case where we say, regarding Shimon, that in Mesoy and his Garsho, that since, in this case there was a get, that Reuven already divorced the Erva before he married Miriam, before he did Yibum, that now, Tzara Seyim Mutarais, now Shimon can marry the widow of Reuven. In other words, time of the Girish v'chakach kines. Avol kanes v'chakach Girish loi. So the Gemara says, you're right. Amar Rav Yirmiyah, Tavra, this is indeed a contradiction. And therefore the authors of these Mishnayos could not have been the same opinion. And mi sheshana zu loy shana zu. Hai Tana, our Mishnah in Daf Beis holds that Misam Apelis, that Yibum starts at the moment of death. And therefore all we care is who was Reuven married to when he died. And if when he died he was no longer married to Achais Ishtoi or to Bita or to any other of the 15 examples of the Mishnah, so then Shimon will be mechuyev to do Yibum or Chalitza with the Tzaras Erva. However, V'hai Tana, the Mishnah later in Daf Lamed holds that no, Nisuyin Harishonim Apilim, that the mitzvah of Yibum, interesting, begins at the moment of marriage. And as we'll learn later, this is not for right now, L'cha'oida, it would come out. Another case. What happens if Reuven had children, but they died before he died? Until now we keep on repeating that it doesn't matter what happened before he died. All we look at as the moment of death. If when he died he had no children nor grandchildren, there's a mitzvah of Yibum. L'cha'oida would come out that according to the Tana and Daf Lamed that holds Nisuyin Harishonim Apilim, would that mean that we'll learn about that later, that if Reuven once had children, even if they died b'chayav, there's no more mitzvah of Yibum, because during the Nisuyim, the whole Yibum went out the window because he had children. We'll see that later. Rava says no, lo'olam chatanahu. Really, it can be the same author. V'zu ve'ein sarach zu ktani. Zu ve'ein sarach zu ktani is a rule that is normally says, as the Ritva points out, only in the same Perek, that a Mishnah, when it introduces a din, sometimes the Seder of Rebbe was to write the din with all of its details, to say the greatest chiddush of its din, and later when the Rebbe talks out that din, even if he gives an example that was not necessarily the best example if you wanted to emphasize the chiddush of the din, but he doesn't care anymore, he can give any example because you can rely on what you said before. So again, even though that this is normally not said from one Perek to the other, nevertheless, we are using the logic of Zu ve'ein sarach le'mer zu, that even though the example he gave was an example that perhaps was not the best if you were to emphasize the Chiddush Adin, but there was no need to emphasize the Chiddush because our Mishnah already made it clear that Yibum goes into effect only at the moment of death, and that is where we look if the Tzara was a Tzaras Erva or not. By death, there's no Tzaras Erva, there's a mitzvah of Yibum and Chalitza. Then the final din of the Mishnah, V'kol she'ichay l'mon. What was the final case of the Mishnah? Again, Reuven was married, let me go back to my case. Reuven was married to the daughter of Shimon. And to an Erva, says the Mishnah, that if the marriage to the daughter of Shimon was only a rabbinic marriage, for example, Shimon already married his daughter off once before, as a ketana, and that husband already divorced her as a ketana. Midai Raisa, Shimon does not have the power to marry off his ketana daughter again. The rabbis gave him that right, and he married his daughter now to his brother Reuven. This is a marriage which is only a rabbinic marriage, and therefore the ketana could refuse the marriage and retroactively annul it. The case of the Mishnah was where the daughter did not do miyun. She did not nullify the marriage. And now Reuven is married rabbinically to Shimon's daughter and to a co-wife. And Reuven dies. So the Mishnah says, one second, you can't say that being that Shimon is connected to an erva, and he's exempt of Yibum and Chalitza to the erva. So therefore he should also be exempt with Tzaras erva. You can't say that here. Because since the marriage to the erva is only a rabbinic marriage, that could have been nullified with Miyun. Mida'iraisa Reuven was only married to one wife who's not related to Shimon. So you cannot exempt Shimon from the holding of Yibum and Chalitza. On the other hand, the Mishnah said, for Shimon to do Yibum with a co-wife looks bad. It looks like he's doing Yibum to the co-wife of an erva. So and because rabbinically, she is a co-wife of an erva. So the Mishnah says Chalitza has to happen to the co-wife. That was the din of the Mishnah. Comes along the Gemara, the Kol Sheichai L'moin, frag the Gemara, 1 second. We learned this just before, I think it was in Daf Yud Beis, when we learned the din of Shmuel. We're going to have more or less a chazara of the sugya. Exactly. The Gemara was in Daf Yud Beis. And what did we learn over there? We learned a din of Shmuel that was based on a machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel regarding the following. In the case that we just gave, Reuven was married to Shimon's daughter, but it was a rabbinic marriage. She was a Yisayma B'chaya Aviyah. She did not do miyun to Reuven. Reuven dies. Let's say there's Shimon, there's Levi, there's Yehuda. Could she do miyun after her husband died? Miyun to one of the Yevamos, by telling him, I don't want to marry you. So it sounds like Beis Hillel was saying that she could do it, and if she would do miyun to the yavam, she would retroactively nullify her marriage to her deceased husband. And l'cha'ira, now the Gemara's kasha is, if she were to do that, then it would come out that the tzara is not a tzaras erva. So therefore, you should be allowed to do yibum with the tzara. Ask the Gemara, v'timayin. And Hashta, let her do Yibum, let her do Miyun after the death of Reuven, v'tesyabem to the Tzara. Is this not a proof to that which Rabbi Oishia said? Rabbi Oishia limited the din of Beis Hillel. Rabbi Oishia says, and not everyone agrees with Rabbi Oishia, that Beis Hillel didn't mean that if there was a death, that after the death she can do Miyun Mamish. No, I didn't mean that. What Beis Hillel meant was only the following. Reuven died. And now, Rabbi Hillel was not speaking about a erva. Reuven dies. Reuven was not married to Shimon's daughter. Reuven was married to a ktana. That was only a rabbinic marriage. And now comes along Shimon, and Shimon wants to marry her. Yibum, mitzvahs yibum. And as we explained before, that the chachamim were mesaken, that before a person does yibum, there's something that has to be done as a pre-yibum yibum, and that's called the ma'amar. Ma'amar means that the yavam would do to her what anyone does to a wife before he marries her. Kedushin. It's a rabbinic engagement. By giving her the money, it's the same procedure, but it's only needed rabbinically. If one were to do it normally, the din then would have been that if he changes his mind, deciding not to marry her, he has to give her a get midrabanan. Comes along Rabbi Yoshe and he says that you know what Beis Hillel meant, that you can do miyun after the death of your first husband. You can do miyun that will exempt you from getting a get from the person from whom you got maimer. You don't need a get at all, but you need chalitza. But it doesn't retroactively nullify the marriage. If that would have been the case, then our Mishnah makes sense. Then the reason why the Mishnah says that you can never do yibum with a co-wife, because even according to Beis Hillel, all that yibum does, all that miyun does, is mima'enes lema'amorai, but ve'enu mima'enes lezikasai. So is this not a proof to Rabbi Oishia? The Gemara says, Loi. Maybe Rabbi Oishia is wrong, and Beis Hillel is to be understood in a broader sense. And this widow, if she does miyun to any of the living brothers, it nullifies her marriage to her first husband, retroactively. Nevertheless, the brother will never be allowed to do yibum with the tzaras erva. It doesn't look good. Marasayin. That's what we learned before. And just like we learned the din of Rami Bar Yecheskel, who taught us, even though when it comes to a man marrying anusas aviv, that means if one's father had a relation out of wedlock with a woman, we learned the machlokes tanoim whether any of the sons will be usher to marry her or not. Right, Rabbi Yehuda is machmer, says it's a lav. The Chachamim say that the isur of one's father's wife is only in wedlock, but if there was a woman that was with the father out of wedlock, there's a machlokes. By a daughter-in-law, everyone agrees that the isur for a man to marry his daughter-in-law is only if the daughter-in-law was married to one son. But if one son had a relation out of marriage to a woman, then the father of this son is allowed to marry her. There's no erev hakalot l'kula alma. Even according to Rabbi Yehuda. So now comes the question, one second. What would be the case if one son is married only rabbinically to a ketana? If she would do miyun when the son is alive, the miyun would retroactively nullify the marriage. Everyone holds the father then can marry her. It's not kalosoi retroactively. What would be the case if there was a death? And she did miyun to one of the brothers, like Beis Hillel. There again, everyone holds that since it looks like when he died, he was married to her. She did a ceremony with one of the brothers, but it doesn't. People don't know the din that it really retroactively nullified the marriage to the original husband. So everyone, let's read it inside. That miyana b'baal muteres. She cannot marry any of the father. Hachinami b'shas nefila nidus kitzaras bitay. And therefore, the Mishnah says that you can only do chalitza with the co-wife of the erva who could have done miyun. Yibum is never an option, even according to Beis Hillel, even if we don't learn the din of Rabbi Oishiyam. Period. Now comes along the Mishnah.
All these cases of miyun, can she decide to do miyun at any point in that marriage?
Yes, as long as she's still a minor. As long as she's still a minor.
But even if the marriage was consummated,
absolutely, a ketana.
So she's a ketana, whatever.
As long as she's a ketana, yes.
She does miyun, it's as if they were never married.
Correct. Exactly. Good. Mishnah. As we said it when we started the Masechta, the din of the Mishnah, that if a man is going to be connected with a zika to an erva, then he's exempt from yibum and chalitza to her and to her tzara and to tzara's tzara. The Mishnah is only giving cases where the original marriage was a marriage kahalacha. It was a kosher marriage. And therefore the Mishnah Taka needed to work out every one of the 15 cases of the Arayis, where, like we said, Reuven and Shimon, Reuven is allowed to marry Shimon's daughter. That marriage was a kosher marriage. More than that, if Reuven dies and he has more than one brother, there's a Shimon and a Levi and a Yehuda, it's shayach that only one brother cannot marry his daughter, but Levi, Yehuda, could do yibum and should do yibum or chalitza with Shimon's daughter. However, there's going to be the 6 other of the 21 arayos are chamuras me'elu. Chamuras me'elu mean there are scenarios that will be for these dinim more stringent. They can only be married to non-family members. Like for example, the erva of imay. It's not shayach that Shimon's mother should fall to him to yibum. Because if Shimon's mother is falling to him to Yibum, it must mean that she was married to one of his brothers. Shimon's mother can never marry any one of Shimon's brothers. It's not shaykh. And the same thing with his father's wife. What are the 6 ervas? His mother, out of wedlock. Eishes aviv, through wedlock. The achais aviv, the aunt, the father's sister. Achais soimei aviv, his paternal sister. The eishes achi aviv, his father's brother's wife, another aunt. And the eishes achiv mi aviv, which means his sister-in-law that had children. Because once you have children, there's no din of yibum. And if there's no din of yibum, then there's an isra of eishes ach. In all of these cases, the only way there can be a shayches of tzaras erva would be what we keep on using the words when it is shaloi b'makom mitzvah. So you have Reuven and you have Chaim. Chaim is not related. Chaim married Reuven's daughter, not related, and Chaim married Miriam. Chaim dies. So we learned that even though that Miriam was a co-wife to Reuven's daughter, since there's no din of yibum or chalitza, shaloi b'makom mitzvah, Reuven later can marry Miriam. We don't say, no, Miriam was a co-wife to his daughter. That is where there's no problem. What's tzaras erva is not a problem, shaloi b'makom mitzvah. And therefore, for there to be a scenario of tzaras erva by imay, it can only be shalei b'makam mitzvah. Reuven's brother, just like Reuven cannot marry his mother, none of his paternal brothers will ever be allowed to marry to that woman. She will be considered mother, imay. So there's no case of tzaras erva by imay, only if, like I mentioned, this woman was married to a foreigner, not to a family member, and there is a co-wife. Period. Comes along the Mishnah and says that this, what we learned, that tzaras erva becomes an erva, like we learned in the Braisa and Daf Gimel Lamed Beis from the word litzroir, says the Gemara Beis Shammai matiren hatzaras la'achim. This is an amazing Mishnah. The Mishnah is telling you that Beis Shammai holds that tzaras erva is not exempt from yibum and chalitza. I mean, this is one of these arguments that are awesome. According to Beis Shammai, go back to our case. Reuven marries Shimon's daughter, and he's married to another wife called Miriam. Reuven dies. Shimon has an obligation to do yibum or chalitza to Miriam. What is it then according to Beis Hillel? What is Miriam?
Nothing.
No, not nothing. She's an erva.
Sorry.
She's an erva. There's a kadis. According to Beis Hillel, if Shimon would have a child with Miriam, the child would be a mamzer. Because any union that is ushered with the penalty of kadis, if that produces, God forbid, a child, the child is a mamzer. According to Beis Shammai, it's a kosher child. Mamzerim is a serious thing. Beis Hillel, however, Beis Hillel, turning the page, Daf Gimel Lamed Beis, and the Mishnah talks through Cholzu. So let's go about this. If the tzaras, the example I'm giving is tzaras bas. So if tzaras bas did chalitza, according to Beis Shammai, chalitza was needed because there's a chiyuv of hibum or chalitza on the tzara. So she becomes now a chalutza, and therefore poislin min kahuna. She can never marry a kohen. A kohen can never marry a divorced woman or a woman who underwent chalitza. However, Beis Hillel, even if they did the ceremony of chalitza, according to Beis Hillel, it was not needed. She's not a chalutza. She herself can marry a kohen. The Gemara is going to ask, obviously, like, why do we have to talk it out? But the Mishnah is talking it out. Or if Nisyabnu, if this woman did yibum, I mean, Shimon did yibum with Miriam, with Reuven's second wife, who was a tzara to his daughter. Beis Shammai says she's a kosher woman, which means, let's say Shimon dies, so she became a widow once, she became a widow again. A widow can marry a kohen. She can marry a kohen. Beis Hillel says she can never marry a kohen. Why not? Because when a woman has one relation, willingly, with a person with whom's having a relation is prohibited with the penalty of kadis, that woman gets the status of a zoina, and a kohen cannot marry a zoina. The child will be a mamzeres, so the children cannot marry Yisraelim. Even she herself will be puzzled because she has a din of a zoina. Now says the Mishnah, so you would think when it comes to this, because of this din, and as we're going to see in Meretz Hashem and Daf Yud Daled Amud Beis, other dinim as well, where you have an argument which has mamzerus implications, that the families of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel will not marry into each other. Right? Lo nimnu Beis Shammai melisa noshim Beis Hillel. V'lo Beis Hillel mi Beis Shammai. They did not refrain from marrying into each other's families. Now let's talk this out. Beis Hillel not marrying into the families of Beis Shammai makes sense. Why? Because Beis Shammai married women that were asur mitam erva to Beis Hillel. Correct? In other words, but what about the opposite? Let's think this through. Why wouldn't Beis Shammai marry into the families of Beis Hillel? Same answer. Because according to Beis Hillel, there's a woman who was mechuyev to get yibum on chalitza, and there is a lav. It's a lav. It's not kadis, but the Torah says that loisia eishes hames hachutza leishzar. According to Beis Hillel, she didn't do chalitza nor yibum. So maybe Beis Shammai should be afraid to marry her. It's isur lav. If they got married, kedushin eschal. If they had kids, the kids are not mamzerim mela. But Beis Shammai might have refrained to marry into Beis Hillel's families because of the fear of marrying into a woman that's mechuyev to get chalitza. But they did it anyway. Question is, why did they do it? So let's jump all the way to the maskana. The maskana of the Gemara is they did it because they used to notify each other. The other option would be already giving an introduction to the next daf, that there's a concept of lois is goydadu, that the Yidden are not allowed to make themselves into groups, separate groups. So there's a certain restriction in how much we can argue. And this might go into the category of sis goydadu, if certain families will have mamzedim according to other halachic opinions. And therefore there's a logic to say that Beis Shammai never actually lived out the halachas that they were paskening. Their argument with Beis Hillel was only a learning argument, but not an actual argument. That would be another way of interpreting the Mishnah, that they married each other's families because everyone kept the same halacha, but we'll see that, God willing, in Daf Yudalud. And likewise says the Mishnah, V'chol hataharis v'tameyos, just like likewise by the laws of Tum and Tara, Shahoyu elu mitaharim ve'elu mitamin, we have a machlokes in Girsa, look inside the first top Tosfos by heart, whether it was Beis Shammai that were the more lenient opinions. And Beis Hillel had certain things that were tamei, that were toyer leBeis Shammai, or reverse. But whichever group was more machmer when it came to the laws of Tum and Tara, so there also one might have thought that one group did not borrow kalim from the other group, because according to one, the kalim of the others might have been tamei. And then when you make food in tamei kalim, the food becomes tamei. Elu al gabi elu. One group did not refrain themselves from making tahara food on the kalim of the others. And again, the maskana will be because they notified each other. Says the Gemara. So first of all, we want to understand the reason of Beis Shammai. Why doesn't Beis Shammai hold that the tzara of the erva is an erva? So Amar, there were two answers. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Ma'itama de Beis Shammai. One is a pasuk. The pasuk is Loisia Eishes Hameis Hachutza Leish Zor. It says in the bottom regarding the mitzvah of Yibum that this widow, this Yevama, should not be Hachutza. Now the word Hachutza means she should not go. There's the outer one. Who is the outer one referring to? Not to another man. Beis Shammai learns that this pasuk is hinting to you about a scenario where a man, the man who died, had two wives. One is called the inner one is called an outer one. What's that, the inner or outer? Chutza mechlal the ikeprimius, the outer one means the tzara of a erva. She's called the outer one. She is not exempt from Yibam and Chalitza. She is not allowed to marry another man without Yibam or Chalitza. Ayu Beis Hillel. The word hachutza means tzaras erva. So he says, no, hachutza is needed for a whole different drash. Rabbi Yehuda Marav. Minayin she'ein kedushin treifsen b'yevama. The Torah says that a woman who is a yevama is not allowed to marry another man. That's the isur lav. The rule normally is that whenever a marriage is only prohibited with the penalty of a lav without kares, if kedushin was affected, the kedushin is chal. Like for example, if God forbid a kohen gives kedushin to a divorced woman, the kedushin is chal, the kedushin goes into effect. They should get divorced, but they need a get. So one might have thought that if another man, Reuven dies, has a widow, childless, Shimon has to do yibam or chalitza. If Chaim Yankel comes and gives her kedushin, so one might have thought kedushin would be chal, because there's only a law violation. So the Torah is telling you lo yisiya isha sameis hachutza, to teach you that kedushin won't be even toifus. Shenemar lo yisiya isha sameis hachutza leish zar lo yisiya by havaya. The Bach takes out the word zar, that the word lo yisiya, the word haya or havaya, to be, is a word of marriage. That lo yisiya means that kedushin cannot even go into effect. So 1 second. So isn't that needed for Beis Shammai? So Beis Shammai says, no. Miksiv lachutz, that limit is learned from the word loisia. Or as we see later, le'ishzar. The Torah doesn't say the word lachutz, the Torah says the words chutza. So we're not speaking about another man, which would have meant lachutz. We're speaking about the wife itself, the outer wife. Beis Hillel says, Kivin chsiv chutza and lachutz is the same thing. The Tanya Rab Nechemya Eimer, we're just learning now in the Chitas and Parshas Zois HaBracha, we learn Ma'oina Elikei Kedem. So Rashi says Ma'oina means La Ma'oin. But that's a rule we find all over Chumash Rashi. That kol teva shetzrich alamed b'tchilasa hitel lo hakos of hey b'seifa. That a hey at the end of the word is interchangeable with a lamed in the beginning of the word. It's a digduk thing. So Beisilil says hachutza and lachutz is the same thing. For example, v'tani devei Rabbi Shmuel, when the Torah says elim, right? The Torah could have written that we reached la elim. The Torah says elima, machanoim, machanoima. We came to Mitzrayim. The Torah says Mitzrayim, Divlosoima, Yerushalayim, Midbara. Whenever there's a hey at the end of the world, we can take off the hey and put a lamed in the beginning, or vice versa. Ubei Shammai, the Gemara asks that Rabbi Yehuda Marav that says that kedushin cannot be chal before the woman underwent yibum or chalitza minal lahu. So the Gemara says from the same pasuk, it says le'izar, it says le'isia eshes hameis. Take out the words achutza. Le'izar, that a izar cannot do marriage. So now the Gemara goes back. Ubei silol nama tepik lu le'izar. So the Gemara goes back. Eina chanami, you're right. And chutza lamali, chutza is to tell you another din. L'rabbeis ha'arusa. If Reuven only got engaged to a woman, no nesuyin yet, and Reuven dies childless, hopefully he was only engaged, there we also have the din of yibum or chalitza. Where do we know that from? From the word chutza. Chutza means a woman that wasn't fully in. She was only engaged. And ve'idach, and where does Beishamai know that there's a din of yibum on a arusa? Because the Torah could have written just the word chutza. The extra hey, ha chutza, is to teach you both. And now in reverse, ve'idach chutza ha chutza lemashmaluhu. Back Rab Shimon ben Pazi explains Beishamai based on a pasuk that tells you hachutza, that soras erva is mechuyev in yibum and chalitza. Comes along Rava Amar. The reason of Beis Shammai, this is fantastic. This is a svara. What is the svara? Look at this. The ein isur chal al isur. Let's think this through. Let's give two cases. The original understanding of the Gemara will not work with all of the arayos. According to the original understanding, the argument of Beis Shammai will only be in a case as I will give or anything similar to it. But according to the maskana of the understanding, Beis Shammai's din is on all of the 15 arayos, that he holds that you have to do yibum or chalitza with tzara serv. Let's give the example of achos ishtoi. So Reuven Shimon married two sisters. Reuven married Rachel, Shimon married Leah. Let's say Reuven marries Rachel first. Shimon cannot marry Rachel. She's married now. But even if she would get a divorce, right now there's an isur called Eishes Ach on this woman. Now that Shimon marries Leah, that's the way we're understanding Beis Shammai, even though normally if Shimon marries Leah, from now on he would not be allowed to marry Rachel because she is Achos Ishtoi, but since she's already prohibited because of Eishes Ach, so ein isur chalal isur. For example, if accidentally b'shoigig he has a relation with Rachel, he'll only has to bring one carbon chatas. There's only one chatas. It's not both eishes ach and achos ishtoi ein isur chalal isur. Now think about it. If we're saying ein isur chalal isur, what's the only isur really? Eishes ach. There's no achos ishtoi. Now she died childless. So Beis Shammai tells Beisilil, Reuven died childless. You can't say that Reuven's other wife is Saras Erva. Who Saras Erva? What Saras Erva? There is no Erva, Achos Ishtoi, it wasn't Chal, because she was already Eishes Ach. It's fantastic.
No, but she's Sarah of the Erva of...
How? She's not an Erva. Eishes Ach is not an Erva that overrides Yibum. Forget, Yibum is by Eishes Ach. The whole case of the Mishnah was that if a person gets connected to a woman who, aside of being Eishes Ach, she's also another erva, so Beis Shammai says she won't be another erva. So the Gemara says, 1 second, that's very limited. Tinach, you're right. Heicha, we had this expression before in Daf Ches, the Nasa Mace, that only works if the one who eventually died, Reuven, first married Rachel, and then Shimon married Leah. So here you can argue that since Reuven married Rachel first, Rachel now becomes Asr to Shimon as Eishes Ach, like Asi Isur Achos Isha, the new Isur that happens when Shimon married Leah cannot go into effect and fall on top of the Isur of Eishes Ach, Ein Isur Halal Isur. But what would be in the reverse case? Elo Nosachai, if Shimon married Leah first. If Shimon marries Leah first, why can he not marry Rachel? Because Rachel now is Achois Ishtay. Now, if Nasa Meis, now if Reuven marries Rachel, in this case, Achois Isha Kadim, Dolo Yasa Isur Eishes Ach V'chayla Isha Achois Isha. And L'choyr over here, if Reuven dies, what is Rachel? Rachel is Achois Ishtay. Achois Ishtay is an erva. So what's this logic of any? So she tzaras erva. So would Beis Shammai agree to Beis Hillel here? The Gemara says no. Even in such a case, and now from this new logic, on all of the 15 cases, you will always use Ein Isur Halal Isur to say that Tzarvas Erva is not exempt. Why? Because Havilei Tzarvas Erva Shalei B'Makam Mitzvah V'Sharia. Perfect. Shimon marries Leah. What is Rachel? Achois Ishtoi. Now Reuven marries Rachel. If Reuven marries Rachel and she's already prohibited on Shimon because of Achois Ishtoi, there is no Isur Eishes Ach. If she's not considered an Eishes Ach, then there's also no Mitzvah V'Yibum on her. It's like Shalei B'Makam Mitzvah. And if it's Shalei B'Makam Mitzvah, what do we keep on learning? That if Reuven has a daughter, and Chaim marries his daughter, another man, not related, and Chaim marry Miriam, then later, if there's a Mitzvah V'Yibum, Reuven can marry Miriam. Why? Because Shalei B'Makam Mitzvah, you can marry Tzaras, your erva. Being that Reuven married Rachel after Shimon married Leah, and since Rachel was already asur because of Achois Ishtoi, the whole Isur of Eishes Ach is not Chal. If there's no Isur of Eishes Ach, it's as if they're not married when it comes to this din. Interesting logic. And therefore that tzara is not a tzara serva. It's not a Makim Mitzvah. Makim Mitzvah is only by Eishes Ach. She's not even an Eishes Ach. Why is she not an Eishes Ach? Because she married an erva. And that would go to Bitoy as well. If Reuven marries Shimon's daughter, since this woman cannot marry Shimon because of his daughter, so the Isur of Eishes Ach is not Chal. It's as if it's not even married. There's no relation here. There's no Yibam here at all. So the co-wife is a co-wife Shalei B'Makam Mitzvah, which is why Beis Shammai says you have to do Yibam or Chalitza. Fantastic. Let's move on. Cholzu, the Mishnah talked out, based on the argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, that if Cholzu Beis Shammai Poislim, asked the Gemara, Pshita, come on, you just said, Beis Shammai said, you're mechuyev to do Chalitza. Yeah, so Beis Shammai will hold that if Chalitza was done, she becomes a Chalutza that's asur to a Kohen. Why would you think otherwise? So the Gemara says no. La'afukei de Rabbi Yechanan ben Nuri. To Omar, Rabbi Yechanan ben Nuri said, Bo v'nesakein lahen soreis she'iyu choltzois le'misyabmois. Rabbi Yechanan ben Nuri said that since Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue min hakotze el hakotze, mamzerus or a mitzvah. So Rabbi Yechanan ben Nuri suggested that even according to Beis Hillel, rabbinically do chalitza. Make a compromise. Yibum don't do, not to make mamzerus, but at least do chalitza to acknowledge the shitas Beis Shammai. Now, if that would have been the case, and if Beis Hillel would have been, so to say, would have compromised with Beis Shammai and make this rabbinic takana to make chalitza, then she would have been a chalutza midrabanan that would have been asad midrabanan to marry a kohen. That's why the Mishnah says that Beis Hillel machshirin. Beis Hillel did not give in to Beis Shammai 1 inch. Beis Hillel says tzaras erva is an erva, and there's no yibum and no chalitza, and don't do chalitza. And if someone did it wrongfully, according to Beis Hillel, what they did means nothing, and she's not a chalutza, she can marry a kohen. Then the Mishnah continues that nesiyabnu Beis Hillel poislim. So again, of course poislim. If she, according to Beis Hillel, tzaras erva is a erva. If she had a relation with the brother, the kids are mamzerim and she becomes a zayna, so of course Beis Hillel will hold that she can never marry a kohen, even if she's not a divorced woman, even if the second husband dies. So Vaiter Hasul Amali answers the Gemara, I did the Tani Cholzu, just for the symmetry in the wording of the Mishnah. We're going to learn through Shas. This is a very common answer. Since the Mishnah spoke out Cholzu B'Shama Beis Hillel, Nisyama B'Shama Beis Hillel. And let's go on. But we have to give a small intro. We are opening up a sugya that's going to go on for the next 2 daf, which is not directly related. It will be also related to here, but it's a much broader sugya, a very interesting question of loy sis goidedu. There is a pasuk in the Torah in which it says like this: Banim atim lashem elekechem. In the same pasuk, then it says loy sis goidedu v'loy sasimu karcha bein einechem lomes. God says, you are children to God. If someone dies, don't mutilate your bodies. Don't rip out the skin in your bodies. Don't rip out your hair as an expression of mourning. First of all, what's the connection between one and the other? The Ramban on the Torah says like this. He gives the famous mashal that there's a king. The king has a son, a prince. He sends the prince on a learning mission to a foreign country. The prince is there. The prince makes friends. But one day comes, the king calls the prince back home. So when the prince leaves, the locals there don't overly mourn for their loss of the prince because they know that the prince didn't disappear. The prince went back to his home. He went back to the palace with the king. So Hashem says that when a person passes away, since Banim Atim Lashem Elekechem, we're going back to God. So the people who are here living shouldn't overly mourn by ripping out their hair or mutilating the bodies, because it's not a loss that is a, God forbid, there's life after death. And that's life, the neshama goes back to God Almighty. So that's the literal pshat. Means rip out. However, there is a homiletic, there is another drash interpreting loises goidedu also means agudois, which means that we are not allowed to create different factions amongst the Jewish people by certain people paskening the halacha is A and other people paskening the halacha is B. We're not allowed to do that. And that's in violation of a law of loises goidedu. Loisasu agudois. I know when people hear this the first time, they can only react with a shocked expression. The whole Shulchan Aruch that we know of is filled with arguments. The whole Torah Sheba'al Peh is filled with arguments. And these arguments many times go all the way down to halacha l'maisa. You have the Mechaber and the Ramah. Different dinim, not only in minig, differences in dinim. So that's an issue. How do we reconcile it? And some of it will be addressed in this sugya over here. And we'll see how this is connected to our Mishnah, because this will be a great example. Bishamai Besilol, right? If there's a mitzvah of Yibum and Chalitza, Beishamai, Tzaras Erva, or Besilol that says it's Asr, so that's Mamish Leises going to do. That's two groups of people, because here you'll have families with Mamzedim, families that will have kosher kids. How do you reconcile that with the love of Leises going to do? So let's open this up. Tanan Hasa. Regarding the din that we learned in Seder Mayid and Masechtas Megillah, when is the Megillah read? Megillah, Nikras, when do we read the Megillah? So how did the Mishnah open up there? Many different dates. It could be on the 11th of Adar, Ba'achad Asar, B'Shnei Asar, B'Shloisha Asar, Ba'arba Asar, B'Chamisha Asar. 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th, and 15th. Leipachos v'lo yoser. That was the Mishnah. And as we learned there, a quick recap of Megillah, that if a person lives in a city that had walls from the times of Yeshua ben Nun, they have to celebrate Purim on the 15th of Adar, just like the people in Shushan Habira. That was a walled city from that miracle. Celebrated Purim on the 15th of Adar. If you live in a non-walled city from the times of Yeshua ben Nun, regularly you have to celebrate Purim on the 14th of Adar. However, if you live in a village, and for whatever reason, the villagers used to be the ones providing food and water for the peoples of the cities. So somehow they made it easier for them by sometimes allowing them to read the Megillah earlier than the 14th, when they are anyways congregating. People used to congregate in the large cities on Mondays or on Thursdays, and on Thursdays. So therefore, work it out. If the 14th is on Monday, everyone celebrated it on the 14th. But if the 14th is on Tuesday, so they celebrated it one day earlier. If the Purim is on Wednesday, they celebrated it 2 days earlier. And if Purim was on Sunday, they celebrated it 3 days earlier on the 11th. So you have people celebrating Purim, reading the Megillah on the 11th, or on the 12th, or on the 13th, or on the 14th, or on the 15th. So came along Reish Lakish and he asked Rabbi Yechanan, Kashe, Ikra Kan, why don't we read the verse, Loisis Goidedu, which means, Loisasu Agudais Agudais, don't celebrate Judaism in a way where different groups of people are keeping different laws. Groups. Faction. Not allowed to do that. Imagine, if God said you're not allowed to do it, and look how we look, imagine if God wouldn't have said it. Can't even imagine how it would have looked. So now, Rabbi Yechanan is challenging Reish Lakish. Now there are different approaches. We'll finish with this. We'll continue next daf in a moment. Is Rabbi Yechanan, who is responding to Reish Lakish, does he hold that you could have factions? That's the way that Rashba will learn the Gemara. That only Reish Lakish holds that there's a prohibition of making groups. Or Rabbi Yechanan agrees to the concept. He's just trying to ask Reish Lakish, I agree with you. But if you are waking up asking this question when you got to Masechtas Megillah, Shas doesn't begin with Masechtas Megillah. Let's go back and start finding other Mishnayos, other Dinim, where we find different people keeping different laws. If you're asking on Megillah, why didn't you also ask in other places? So regardless what Rabbi Yechanan's personal opinion would be, we're going to begin a discussion between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yechanan. Reish Lakish wondering, how can you say this din when you're creating factions? And Rabbi Yechanan is going to try to challenge him back, and there's going to be a happy conclusion, a certain clarification. When is one not allowed to make factions, and when is one allowed to make it? And indeed, like we mentioned, there are plenty parts in Yiddishkeit where we have these factions, a lot of factions.